Hello, and welcome to today's event. Você vai me servir, emprego doméstico no Brasil e nos Estados Unidos. A conversation with Chancellor's Public Scholar at UC Berkeley and faculty member at the Haas School of Business, David Evan Harris. I am Janet Wagaman, the program manager at the UC Berkeley Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. I am happy to be here today and have the opportunity to host you to highlight new work from UC Berkeley scholars on Latin America and the Caribbean. In a minute, I will hand you over to the speaker for today's event. But before I do that, let me provide a brief introduction. David Evan Harris is a Chancellor's Public Scholar at UC Berkeley and a continuing lecturer at the Haas School of Business, specializing in topics related to responsible artificial intelligence, democracy, and social movements in Brazil and Latin America. Harris' latest work is Você vai me servir, emprego doméstico no Brasil e nos Estados Unidos, which was released by Alameda Editorial in 2022. In this book, Harris presents a comparative ethnography of the relationships between domestic workers and their employers in Brazil and the United States. Harris' work aims to understand better the reproduction and legitimation of inequality and the influence of neoliberal economic ideology in both countries. During the event, we welcome questions from the audience, and we have enabled the Q&A feature on Zoom. You can find the Q&A button on the bar below me. Now, I hand it over to David Evan Harris.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here, and thank you so much, everyone, for attending. This is an exciting moment for me to be able to present this to this audience at this important center. So this is the book cover in Portuguese, and I've translated a lot of graphics, but there's some still in Portuguese through the slides. I didn't get to translate everything, so I apologize for that. But as Janet said, the title of the work in English is You Will Serve Me, Domestic Work in Brazil and the United States. The book came out last year, and I have this interesting experience, though, that most of the work was written more than a decade ago. It's actually based on my master's thesis that I wrote when I was a student at the University of Sao Paulo. I moved to Brazil in 2004 and finished this in 2008. And the University of Sao Paulo is an amazing place for me. It has a lot in common with UC Berkeley, actually. A very large public university, lots of critical thinking going on, and a really interesting academic and intellectual environment to work in. And as such, this has become an exercise in history in some ways, and looking at a work that is older. The choice to publish it so long after it was released was exciting by my publisher, and that was at the urging of my advisor, Professor Seiji Hirano, and it represents an opportunity to look back, and then also to look at how things, unfortunately, in some cases, haven't changed that much. So looking back, I want to actually go even further back. This is one of the figures from the book, and this is a funcionario, which is a worker, but probably a state worker, a colonial worker, out for a walk with his family. And this is a painting by Jean-Baptiste Debray, a famous painter who worked in the colonial period in Rio de Janeiro. And so this is, you can see, this is an illustration of something that continues to today, which is the idea that domestic workers are part of the family of the employers. And so in this case, you saw domestic workers in this image who are at the back of the line here, who are probably slaves. And you can note there's a male domestic worker in this group as well, and there are what appear to be adult and child members of the group of domestic workers. Now, this is eerily similar to an image that I found in this century in the United States. This is CertifiedHouseholdStaffing.com. The website's still up. Doesn't seem to actually work if you want to go through the process of hiring, but you can see the imagery is similar. And so these historical references or anachronistic outfits for domestic workers still have currency in both countries. And this is interesting because there was a period in the 20th century where you saw a lot of people predicting the end of domestic work as an occupation. Now this is a quote from Sarah Green of the National Women's Trade Union League. This is 100 years ago. We in America feel that it does not take brains to do washing. So all we have to do now is turn on the electricity and let that do it for us. If you women in Europe would do that, there would not be so many women in domestic service. So this reflects an attitude. There were also economists and social scientists for a period from as early as the 1920s, perhaps before, and into the 1950s and 60s that were making a lot of predictions about the decline of this profession. And if you look at the numbers, and this is the percent of the workforce, the female workforce, doing domestic work in both the United States and in Brazil. And so you could see why in the 1920s it might have felt like this was a profession in decline, or even in the 40s or the 50s and into the 70s. But then aligned with the rise of neoliberal economic policies or free market economic policies in the 1980s in both countries, you start to see a change and you start to see a resurgence. And this is a big part of the theme of this book is why, even as history moves forward, we don't see the expected decline of this profession. We do see changes, though, in it, and I'll get into a lot of that. Now, one obvious reason is inequality. So inequality was in decline in most of the 20th century in both of the countries. It is very hard to get consistent measures of inequality, but then started going up in the 1980s in both countries. And that inequality, it's not hard to understand why inequality would result in increasing numbers of domestic workers if you think about just the the question of supply and demand, or a question of people at the top who have money versus people who don't have other options, because domestic work is not usually a first choice occupation. So this brings me into the question of who are domestic workers, and if we can get to know the types of people in this employment, then we can start to understand better the dynamics of the work and the way that people understand the work. So firstly, gender. Women make up the vast majority of domestic workers, and that's this is true in the United States for this diagram. This is also very much true in Brazil. You could see 90.2% of domestic workers are women, compared to 46% of all other workers. And I won't get into any more of the details on that one. Then Black and Hispanic workers in the United States make up a disproportionate share of domestic workers as well. So again, if you look at this chart, this gives all the details of that. And this is the category of Hispanic doesn't exist in Brazil and in any meaningful way. But in Brazil, there is a similar dynamic that you can find, which is that in Brazil, the trend overwhelmingly, especially more visible in certain cities than others, is that domestic workers tend to have darker skin than their employers. And that racial disparity in employment is something that's important to contextualize historically. So historically speaking, we have to understand the migration patterns of slaves that were brought both from Africa to both South and North America. And you can see from this chart the patterns of migration. There were about 10 times more slaves that were brought to Brazil than to the United States. But still, the history of the slave trade is a critical factor in determining the nature and the population and the character of domestic work in both countries, more so in some regions of the United States, however, than others. You can also look at, in the United States, again, this category of Hispanic origin is now not in common usage as much as terms like Latino or Latina or Latinx, Latine. But this map is useful in understanding the patterns of population, and in domestic work, this results in higher percentages of Latinx domestic workers in California, in the Southwest, and in Texas, compared to larger Black populations of domestic workers in the South and the East of the United States. So this brings me to this Venn diagram that I'll revisit, and talk about in some depth here, because this is at the heart of my study. So my study was actually primarily ethnographic in nature, though I did collect secondary source statistics from census bureaus and other research in both countries. I interviewed mostly employers of domestic workers. I also conducted interviews with domestic workers themselves in both California and Sao Paulo state in Brazil. And as a result of that ethnographic research, as well as historical research in both countries, I developed this Venn diagram. And what I'm trying to describe here is the character of the relationship between employer and domestic worker in Brazil and in the United States. So I'll start by looking at the left side of this Venn diagram in Brazil. So in Brazil, it's much more common to see the full-time domestic worker in a home without children or elderly people. And this fits a historical term that we wouldn't use today, but the historical idea of the servant. And that is something that is frequent to see in Brazil, and very rare to see in the United States, that you'd have someone working full-time without those care needs in the home. And it's probably in decline in Brazil still, but it's significant and important to call out. And and those people may live in the home, or they may also live out of the home, live in their own home. Now, the commonalities between the two, the common types of domestic work employment in the two countries, are the housekeeper. In Portuguese, you'd call that the faxineira, or the diarista. And that might be someone who comes up to twice a week in both of the countries. So you see this in both countries. It's fairly similar, though there also are some behaviors that are quite different in both countries, even with the housekeeper model. And I'll talk more about that. Then you also see nannies in both countries that could be full-time. Live-in is much more common in Brazil than it is in the United States. And that may or may not include cleaning as part of the job. And again, in both countries, you see dynamics of formality and informality of working relationships. There has been, in part due to legislation in both countries in the last few decades, an increase in formal hiring, which is generally good for domestic workers. But there are very big differences between being a domestic worker in both countries, whether you are hired formally or informally. And there are also parallel race, ethnicity, and gender patterns that I discussed earlier in both countries. Now, something that you don't see nearly as much in Brazil, that you do see much more often in the United States, is what I call the professional cleaning service. And that is a much more commoditized, prepackaged relationship, where instead of hiring an individual to clean your home, you hire a company that then brings people, and they may be different people every time, maybe the same ones, to your home. But your actual employment relationship is not with the actual domestic worker. Another type of relationship that you see in the United States that you do not see in Brazil, perhaps this is even more rare in Brazil. I have heard stories of professional cleaning services starting to take shape in the last few decades in Brazil, but still uncommon. The au pair is quite different. That relationship of having someone come from another country to live in home in the United States with reduced rights and quite low pay if you don't take into account the in-kind living arrangements that are usually provided and food. But that au pair relationship does not exist. It's not a term that's used in Brazil. But another dynamic that's really important to consider in the United States is the question of immigration status. And immigration status is very important to think about because so many domestic workers, and this is more the case when you think about domestic workers from Latin America who are working in places like California, when they're undocumented, and when they're undocumented, that means that they have dramatically less rights and access to justice systems in the case of abuses by their employers, and that's, although there are small numbers of Bolivian or other Latin American country immigrants in Brazil working as domestic workers, it's not significant. In southern Brazil, however, you do see immigration patterns that are worth calling out that I'll get to in some charts later, but you do see patterns of northeastern Brazilians who are more frequently descended from Africans or Afro-Brazilians and migrating from the northeast of Brazil to the south of Brazil, and that has an impact on that relationship as well. So looking more deeply at the character of the relationship, this is a very rough spectrum because the countries are both so big and so complicated, but you do often see in Brazil a what my advisor described and convinced me of over the course of the time that we worked together as a more affective relationship between domestic worker and employer or family. It's much more common in Brazil that you talk about domestic workers as members of the family, and it's a more familiar relationship, and it's in some ways a pre-capitalist relationship. And in 19th century and earlier 20th century Brazilian writings on this, there's a term called the agregado da família, and the idea in understanding this is that it comes from a relationship forged in slavery, where you have and also after the decline of slavery, you have slaves or slave descendants who really depend on slave owners or the descendants of slave owners and an emotional relationship with them. And the importance they talk about in Brazilian scholarship of this, the importance of maintaining that effective relationship is critical because you depend on the wealthier family for so much, for almost favors is the term that's used in the literature. So this there are traces of this pre-capitalist model that still exist, especially in that full-time or in-home or live-in domestic worker relationship in Brazil. It's still often a lifelong relationship. You see domestic workers who will spend decades or their entire life employed by one family. You sometimes see and hear stories in Brazil of multi-generational transitions where the same family of domestic workers serves the same family of employers. It is a more what you'd call traditional relationship, and also can serve as a status symbol in Brazil. Now, again, this is a rough typology and these are complex countries, but in the United States, what you see, and this is reflected in the structures of the relationships that I describe in the Venn diagram, as well as in some of the cultural aspects that I'll describe below, is this is what you might consider, and I say this in a critical way, a more rational type of relationship, that especially that type of the professional cleaning service where you pay for something to happen. And there's a phenomenon that I observed in the United States that I almost never observed in Brazil, of employers often trying to not be at home when a domestic worker cleans. And you can see that evident in this article from Happy Cleans of Oklahoma City. The question is asked, do I leave or stay when the house cleaner comes? And the fact that this is a question that is being written about as part of an FAQ is really indicative. And many American employers of domestic workers in the United States that I spoke with talked about trying to leave, and in some cases it was about not being in the way. Was a term that a phrase that I heard used frequently, but often it was also related to a discomfort, simply a discomfort. And when I prodded around that discomfort, sometimes people would say they're not comfortable telling someone what to do. Sometimes it relates to discomfort around language. But Americans also really are not comfortable with giving direct feedback or direct orders to domestic workers in the way that I observed in Brazil. In Brazil, it's much more common to have employers tell domestic workers exactly what to do in clear ways. Americans, in many of the cases where I spoke to people, had a lot of trouble with that. Americans in many cases where I spoke to people wanted a more impersonal relationship, and it was much more traditionally capitalistic, in the sense that they wanted it to be an exchange of money, not an emotional or affective tie. It was seen much more often as temporary or even instrumental, and much more what you might describe as modern or even commoditized. Now, there are many ways that I explored and learned about these relationships during the time that I was in Brazil. And I see there are some things popping up in the chat here. Oh, okay. So if anyone wants to you ask questions, you can use the Q&A feature, and I'll get to those at the end. So one way that you can see a big difference in Brazil in the structure of the relationship is actually in the structure of housing. So this was an advertisement that I saw for a new condo with 2 bedrooms for domestic workers, and this was for sale in October 2007 in a neighborhood in Sao Paulo for 800,000 reais. And so you can see here the living quarters, and this is often the case in Brazilian homes. The living quarters for the domestic workers are right here. So I hope that you can see this clearly. So you can see there all the areas with white tile are either bathrooms or what you'd call the área de serviço, or the service area of the house. And now this is very common architecturally, that you see the service area has the laundry area in it. You can see that these 2 rooms for the domestic workers are barely the size of 2 beds. This one looks smaller than this one. So this one looks like the size of about 1 3/4 of a bed. This is the size of about 2 beds. And there's even a song in Brazil called 2 by 2 is the size of the, or it has a lyric from a song, 2 by 2 is the size of the domestic worker's room. And that's because it's 2 meters by 2 meters is a standard size. So you see there's also a bathroom there. And then you can walk directly from the domestic worker's bedroom into the laundry room and then into the kitchen where you prepare food. And then they can go through this room, this door, to bring the food directly to the table. And because the house is structured this way, the employers of the domestic workers could potentially not interact for significant portions of their time at home, perhaps except at meal times with the domestic workers, even though they are sharing an apartment that they live in together. So this was an article that I thought this was recent. And it's called She is Family, How Slavery, and this is a translation that's not perfect, but how slavery cultural heritage puts the health of domestic workers at risk during the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can imagine how COVID would create particular challenges and how domestic workers would be particularly vulnerable in these situations. So another thing that's often striking to Americans or people from the United States who visit Brazil is this store that is a frequent sight at malls in Sao Paulo, and this is a store that sells uniforms for domestic workers, and it's not uncommon to see people wearing uniforms like this in Brazil who do domestic work. However, it is quite surprising for most Americans when they enter into a home and a home of a Brazilian and see someone in this. It feels very anachronistic. Another anachronistic experience that I had that I saw with one employer was this what's called a table bell. And this bell was, on the table, lived on the table or on the buffet next to the table where the employers ate. And this was something that I saw in a family's home that had two live-in domestic workers. And they would ring the bell when they wanted the domestic workers to bring in the dinner, and they would ring it when they were ready for the second course or the dessert, and they would ring the bell when they were ready for the domestic workers to come in and clear the table. And that, again, was something that felt quite anachronistic and from my American perspective, it was very different. Now I'll switch to some other elements from the US that demonstrate that more capitalist or even commodified version of domestic services. This is maids.com. And again, you go to a website and you place your order just as you would with any other type of commerce. This is Merry Maids, which you can also buy a franchise of and turn it into your own company. Now, Barbara Ehrenreich wrote an excellent book about this called Nickel and Dime, where she actually worked at a company like Merry Maids, and it might have actually been Merry Maids. And she was actually not even paid for the time that she spent between houses in the car, and it was barely possible for her to get by and to live while working for that company. And I say this to really drive home the point that just because we see what we might call a more modern or a more rational way of employing domestic workers in the United States, it does not mean in any way that it's better to be a domestic worker or that that type of employment is better in the United States. Now, there's a lot of history that's interesting in the United States too. So these are two posters from 1937. This is the Household Service Demonstration Project. And this was part of the Works Progress Administration under FDR's New Deal in the United States in the 1930s and early 1940s. Now, this program lasted 5 years, and it was, a way to get women employed coming out of the Great Depression. And this is really interesting to see because it goes against the idea that I shared earlier from the 1920s that perhaps with modern appliances and with changes in social structure, we would see less and less domestic workers in the United States. So there have also been moments where the US government directly attempts to produce more domestic workers. So there has been progress in these areas, but I think these statements are all still broadly true. Laws discriminate against domestic workers in both the US and Brazil. There are different standards for working hours compared with other jobs. In the US, historically, and at the federal level, domestic workers don't have the right to unionize because of being exempted, at least certain categories of domestic workers exempted from the Fair Labor Standards Act. In the US, there's a big difference that I alluded to earlier, which is that due to citizenship or immigration status, domestic workers often have almost no rights at all. In Brazil, there are also many situations where domestic workers have often no rights, and that's due to informality. In Brazil, there's a term called carteira assinada, which means signed working card, and that basically means paying over the table, paying formally. And if you don't pay formally, it's very hard for domestic workers in Brazil to bring any kind of legal claims against employers. Um, and in the US, there are no laws offering vacation to domestic workers. I wanted to dive a little deeper into something I mentioned earlier. So the differences in Brazil um, between domestic work relationships, that character of the relationship or the type of employment agreement, are pretty significant across different cities in Brazil. Now, this might be a little bit hard to parse if you're not familiar with Brazilian geography, but you can see that in the southern Brazilian city of Sao Paulo, where I did most of my work, um, the monthly or mensalista monthly domestic workers were the most common type of relationship, and monthly is this darker blue and red here, or orange. And but there's still significant 24% diarista, or a house cleaner, or someone who comes in just for a day or part of a day at a time. In the city of Salvador, you saw sorry, I should also call out in Sao Paulo, you had 44% who are monthly workers with in a formal relationship. The dark blue is the formal working relationship. Sorry, the dark blue is without the formal working relationship. You can see in the northeast of Brazil, it's dramatically less formalized than in Sao Paulo. And something else worth calling out on this chart is that the city that has the most formalized of the monthly or the full-time domestic workers is Porto Alegre in the far south of Brazil. So I'll move on because it's easy to get to fall into a rabbit hole on analyzing this one, but you can read more about it in the book. So it's also interesting to look at the Gini coefficient, and Gini coefficient again is the measurement of inequality, of economic inequality, income inequality specifically, in the different cities, and how that relates to the percentage of monthly workers. And so you can see there is some kind of rough correlation between the inequality and the number of full-time domestic workers. So you need more income inequality basically to have families that are have enough income, and families that are in need, or individuals who are in need enough to do that full-time domestic work. And you see that that relationship here. There's also a similar loose but apparent correlation between the just total number of people occupied in domestic work and the inequality of the different cities. So there's also, moving to a different topic, in both countries, a gender relationship and a sexualization of domestic workers that can be quite uncomfortable to discuss and to learn about. But I think it would be inappropriate for me not to touch on this, because it's such an important part of the dynamic of gender that has defined this profession for so long. So this was an interview that I did with a Brazilian man who is probably today in his 50s. And he described to me that he and his friends, when he was growing up in Brazil, would regularly have sex with their family's domestic workers when they were teenage boys. And I asked him, would the domestic workers get pregnant? And he said, well, it did happen. And then what happened to the children? And he said, well, they grew up there around the homes. And I asked, did people understand or know who the fathers were? And he said, well, no one spoke very much about this. And I asked, but did the parents of your friends know that you were doing this? And he said, yes, sometimes they even incentivized it or encouraged it. And I said, encouraged? What does that mean? And he said, well, um, they thought that maybe it was more safe or more controlled to have it happen inside of your own home. I spoke to another person who told me that they also knew that this was something I heard from definitely more than one source, of stories of fathers deciding to encourage their sons to have sex with their domestic workers. Um, and in that interview, I asked, well, why would they want to do that? And the answer I received was, well, to make sure that my son wouldn't turn out gay. That was again a surprising answer, and then I continued to ask questions around that. And at one point, I received another answer about this, and someone said, well, it's either they have sex for the first time with the domestic worker or with a prostitute. And so these sexual attitudes and practices in Brazil were, again, quite surprising to me. But also, the United States does not get off the hook for this. It's a common trope to have the sexy maid, and there is a large amount of production of pornography in the United States that features fantasies of men having sex with domestic workers. And this dates back quite some time. The most famous example is Sally Hemings, who was both a slave and a partner and mother to many children of Thomas Jefferson. And again, we see different relationships in the two countries, but we don't, I'm not making a value judgment about which one is better or worse. You just see different historical trajectories taking place. This is an image of the US presidents between 1970 or 1789 and 1885 who enslaved African Americans. So again, to that point, different is not better. I have to emphasize this as an American doing ethnographic research in Brazil. There's obviously a hazard in coming off as someone who's saying that one country's relationships are in some way better than the other. And I like to go to Dick Gregory, who is a comedian, actor, and activist, who has spoken in really interesting ways about this. This is an unrelated joke, but just to give you a sense of his sense of humor. I never believed in Santa Claus because I knew no white dude would come into my neighborhood after dark. So Dick Gregory also had a famous quote about race relations, which came up a number of times for me in talking to scholars that have worked and done research in this area. Down south, and this is a reference to the American South, down south, they don't care how close I am as long as I don't get too big. And up north, they don't care how big I am as long as I don't get too close. Now, I think in this case, thinking about California, California has much more in common with the historic North, even though it's the West. And I think that the South, the characterization of the South here, actually applies in the most in Brazil to the Brazilian Northeast. And again, you can see in some ways that those geographical relations of current day distribution of domestic workers between the live-in or the full-time domestic work in the United States and in different parts of Brazil actually corresponds quite clearly when you look at different Brazilian cities to the places that had the largest populations of descendants of slaves. And so again, you see more of that in Northeast Brazil, but in some ways, Dick Gregory's quote aligns with much of Brazil aligns with how he describes the South in this relationship. Now, if you think a little bit more about California and about that rational form or even commodified relationship between employers and domestic workers that they hire, it's interesting to think about other ways that people in the United States have tried to reveal working relationships of power. And so this is the website of a group called United Students Against Sweatshops. And this group gained prominence when I was an undergraduate. Um, and this is, they talk about organizing for student and worker power. And a lot of the work of Students Against Sweatshops was about unveiling the hidden relationships of power behind the commodities such as clothing and shoes that we consume in the United States. And in the book, I talk a bit about this concept called commodity fetishism, which comes from Marx, and is this idea that even when we have an object like a telephone, it's not really just an object. The object is the culmination and representation of systems of power and relationships between human beings, and also between natural resources and control of natural resources, control of means of production, that hides power relationships. And you can see this is an ad campaign called I Sweat, and it's a satire of the Apple ad campaigns for iPhones and iPods, that's talking about how, and these are people working in a factory making iPhones or iPods, and that really, that desire, especially in the United States and contemporary capitalist society, to purchase things that hide relationships of power or perhaps relationships of exploitation, really fits closely with the dynamics that I described in the ways that people in the United States prefer to or choose to hire more frequently the professional cleaning service or the more commodified version of domestic work versus the more affective and emotional type. And of course, again, I'll keep coming back to Gini coefficients and inequality. As countries have less and less inequality, you see less and less domestic work. Generally, you have Brazil over here, and this is just comparing different countries and their Gini coefficients. Brazil is often ranked as the most unequal country in the world. Sometimes there are others, usually smaller countries that compete with Brazil for that most unequal. South Africa comes in second there. Mexico also very unequal. And then you see the United States. The United States is quite unequal for wealthier or more developed or higher income countries. However, if you look at places like Norway, they have dramatically less inequality and also dramatically less domestic work. I'm realizing I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move quickly here. You can see the world Gini coefficient, and again, these numbers are a little hard to calculate, but the world Gini coefficient, inequality has gone up or over time over the last 2 centuries. And there have been moments where it went down also. Now, this is an illustration actually that looks at the ratio of the top 1% to the bottom 50% in terms of income. And in some ways, this is an even better number to look at and think about when you're thinking about domestic work. And this goes from 1820 to 2020. And so you can see again this drop in global income inequality starting in 1940, maybe a little bit of a drop beginning in 1900, but then coming back up in the 80s. And maybe there's a drop here as well. Now, if we had a lot of time to get into this, we'd also look at the relationship of income inequality across countries versus income inequality inside of countries. And that is also a big shift. So wrapping up this part of the presentation, I'll say it's very important to situate our economic transactions in a historical context that incorporates an understanding not just of economic inequality, but race, gender, and global political economy. If you're lucky enough to have the opportunity to hire a domestic worker, we need to remember all of the relationships of power that put us in that position and consider whether we're comfortable with those relationships. If we're not comfortable, I would say we have an obligation to consider what we might be able to do to change those relationships. Now I want to move into the last or the second to last part of the presentation, which is about policies to reduce inequality. Now, there's a wonderful organization called the National Domestic Workers Alliance in the United States. And they have been fighting to put the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights in place in the US. And there are similar wins actually at the national level in Brazil that have happened. In the United States, there are 10 states that already have domestic workers' bills of rights. And there's a bill that's been introduced at the federal level. Kamala Harris was one of the senators behind it. It has not yet passed at the federal level, but that would be a wonderful achievement for domestic workers. But as you know, and as we've seen in this presentation, these issues that I'm touching on, the inequities manifested in the field of domestic work are also inequities that are seen more broadly in society. So one thing to think about also is the question of reparations. Now, reparations for descendants of slaves obviously addresses the issues of descendants of slaves, but it doesn't address the issues in domestic work experienced by all domestic workers, excuse me. But the California Reparations Report was released this year. It was created based on a law passed by the California State Legislature in 2020. And unfortunately, the latest polling that I've seen is that cash reparations in California are not a popular solution, but it still remains to be seen what the state legislature will do about reparations. But this bill did not only, the report produced after the bill was passed, didn't recommend only cash reparations, but it also recommended tax breaks, help with healthcare, free tuition, and I think that's significant. Now, of course, affirmative action is another solution that can help people, help people find pathways out of inequitable situations and out of poverty. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court of the United States has ruled against affirmative action, paralleling what had already happened in California. And this is an unfortunate situation. Brazil, however, has some other interesting wins. There's a program in Brazil that's been around for a few decades now called Bolsa Familia. And this is a really interesting program that has had many victories. And it's what's called a conditional cash transfer program, where if families demonstrate that their children are going to school and that they are having regular doctor visits, that they then receive cash through this credit card. And this is really interesting because it's some Brazilian scholars have called this the largest wealth distribution in human history, which is historic and important. And this was something that Lula, the current and former president of Brazil, he had a period where he was not president, but he's back, that he was involved in from his first term and before he was even president. So conditional cash transfers, very much worth reading about, and very related to this idea of basic income. And this is interesting to think about in the context of a global discussion that's taking place right now about basic income. There's a group called Unconditional Basic Income Europe, and this is a quote from Naomi Klein. That's why I talk about basic income as well, that there has to be a stronger social safety net, because when people don't have options, they're going to make bad choices. Let's have better choices on the table. So Switzerland has been taking action on this. There's also, and this brings me back to the community of people that I currently study and the community that I'm working in right now, which is Silicon Valley. My recent writing has been about artificial intelligence, and Give Directly is an organization that is funded by a Silicon Valley tech billionaire or a number of tech billionaires, and they've done a lot of work, including very rigorous quantitative studies, randomized control trials, to figure out what the best way is to improve the lives of poor people around the world. And they've come to the conclusion that the best way to do this is to just send money directly to the extreme poor. Now, this is often talked about as a big innovation, but it's something that Brazil has been doing for decades through programs like the Bolsa Familia. Now, it's I have to say, though, that there are some important questions to ask about this. So, this is a picture of someone who maybe some of you recognize. This is a much younger version of him in 2016. This is Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, the company that brought us ChatGPT. And in this in this article from Tech Insider, it describes how Sam Altman has been obsessed with the idea of unconditional basic income, and he's even done some experiments with basic income in Oakland, even before he started OpenAI. And he's also the co-founder of a company called WorldCoin that is seeking to make universal basic income a reality globally. Now, WorldCoin is worthy of a little bit of side eye. It's a great idea to be distributing money to people around the world, but there is and they have this nice slogan: "The global economy belongs to everyone." But to collect your WorldCoin money, you have to get your irises scanned. And this is an example of one of these silver orbs that they use to scan your eyeballs. And so you're giving them some very important personal data that you can not get back, and you're not going to get new eyeballs either. And this is something where Edward Snowden made a comment saying you should never let them scan your eyes, because that's your body is not a punch card. So I think we have to look skeptically on this. And also, if we look at the revenue model of WorldCoin, there it does, if you look at it with a critical eye, according to some people, it looks a bit like a giant Ponzi scheme. So again, worth thinking about these ideas around universal basic income. Very important if, as people like to predict, artificial intelligence brings us robots that do all our housework. In this, there is a universe in which maybe we don't have domestic workers in the future. But I think it's important to look back to the quotes that I shared from as much as 100 years ago about the foreseeing the end of domestic work with skepticism. If we introduce new technologies like artificial intelligence that eliminate massive numbers of jobs, but we do that in a context of deeper and deeper inequality, I think we could just as easily still see increases in jobs that are untenable for many people, increases in inequality, and still have lack of access to basic services, and a really continuation of injustice across society. So there's another interesting study, actually, of Bolsa Familia, and this was conducted by a group of scholars in Brazil. And they found some problems with Bolsa Familia. Although it does produce great individual benefits, it does not generate the type of collective benefits that you might like. And while you can give everyone money, if you don't also make structural changes, such as universal access to preschool or full-time school. In Brazil, elementary schools often operate only for a half day, and so some families will bring their children to elementary school in the morning, and other families in the afternoon, and that is a huge barrier. That's unevenly distributed across Brazilian states, but quite common, and that's quite a barrier to people being able to work full time and make a living. Access to higher education is a very problem, although Brazil has wonderful public universities like the one I was lucky enough to attend, the University of Sao Paulo. There are not enough seats at those institutions. And so paradoxically, people with lower income end up paying more for their higher education in many cases. And then access to public health, although Brazil does have universal health care, the quality is very uneven of services that people have access to. And this is the last quote I want to share. And this calls out that low income is only one of the social risks to which the poor are exposed. We still have to analyze the population's access to goods and public services, such as education, health, property, work, food, transportation, sanitation, water, and housing. Poverty is a multidimensional situation of socioeconomic fragility. This is from Claudio De Deca. Again, this is to say that universal basic income, although people in the artificial intelligence community are very excited about that as a possibility, very excited about the possibility of artificially intelligent robots saving us all from doing lots of work, becoming our robot servants. It won't deal with so many aspects of poverty that are really collective action challenges that we have to address by really changing the structure of our societies. So I'm going to conclude on that and move over to Q&A. Thank you so much again, Janet, for having me and the opportunity to speak to this group.
Thank you for your exceptional presentation. As someone originally from South America, I was particularly captivated by your comparative exploration of the relationships between domestic workers and their employers in my home region and in the United States. Your analysis provided a fascinating and deeply enlightening perspective, especially concerning the influences of capitalism and historical slavery on these relationships. A dimension I had not fully appreciated before, truly enlightening. I'm now going to open the virtual floor to some questions that we've been receiving from the audience. And again, feel free to keep sending them through the Q&A feature or the chat below. The first one, you mentioned regional variations in domestic worker relationships within countries. Do those regional variations track with the history of enslavement and its prevalence within countries?
Yes. So great question. Thank you for the question. So yes, they do largely, and maybe I'll go back and put something back on the screen again. So the history of slavery has a really large impact on this, but also I'm going to try and share my screen again. History of slavery definitely has an impact on the regional differences, but also geopolitics and the relationship between Latin America and North America in the United States, and so that's much more complicated. That's a legacy of colonialism, of suppression and disempowerment of indigenous peoples in the Americas, and additionally, this relates to patterns of European migration. So someone said something to me once that really stuck with me, which is that if you want to understand the Brazil and the United States and the regional differences in both countries, you just need to look at the equator as a mirror. And some of this is in some ways climactically determined. And I have on this chart where slaves were transported, but I don't have on this chart patterns of European migration. But what you might be aware of in Brazil is that they're in the south of Brazil, and I'll go to the chart that I showed as well. In southern Brazilian cities, which in this chart, the southern Brazilian cities are really Porto Alegre and Sao Paulo. Belo Horizonte is kind of in between. And then Recife and Salvador are the two northeastern ones. I apologize, this isn't organized north to south. And really, we're talking northeast and southeast here. So the southern Brazilian cities of Porto Alegre and Sao Paulo had much larger migrations of descendants of Germans, Italians, Portuguese, Spanish, and then even Japanese and Lebanese, much more to Sao Paulo than to Porto Alegre. And so you have bigger European populations there that were post-slavery migrations. And so that post-slavery migration of Europeans to southern Brazil creates a set of frequently of employers of domestic workers who often migrate from the Northeast, sometimes permanently, sometimes temporarily, to the Brazilian South in search of higher wages. The wages of a domestic worker in southern Brazil are significantly higher than in northern or northeastern Brazil, which provides an incentive for that migration. And also, not just the wages are higher in southern Brazil, the chances that you will be able to work in a formalized way and have workers' rights because you're employed formally are significantly increased in southern Brazil. And if you look at who is migrating from northeastern Brazil to southern Brazil, it's very frequently descendants of slaves. And that's a perhaps long answer to your question. Just to cap that off, though, so you have the European colonial influence, you have the slave descendants influence determining the regional variations, and then you have patterns of migration of indigenous or people descended from a mix of colonial and indigenous people from Latin America moving into the west and southwest of the United States. So in some ways there's a slavery. Oh, and I forgot to mention the sort of geographic, and this is not a perfect correlation, but if you look at like the places that had a climate to grow cash crops like sugar and tobacco, the places where sugar and tobacco grew were the places where it was most economically valuable to have large numbers of slaves. So the cash crops in Brazil were mostly grown in the north and northeast of Brazil, and cash crops in the United States during the period of slavery were more often grown in the south, really the southeast of the United States. And so you have that relationship too. Southern Brazil or southeast Brazil looks racially and genetically, historically, more like the northeastern United States or New England in historical perspective, because the climates are more similar in New England and in the far south or southeastern Brazil, and so you have less ability to even grow cash crops that you would benefit economically from having large numbers of slaves to grow. I hope that answered the question. If you want to ask a follow-up or get any clarification, I'm happy to answer that
Okay,
or speak
to
to it more.
the
Oh, sorry.
person.
Last thing. Indigenous populations, of course, in both countries, I should say, indigenous populations that were there before in North America and in South America on the coasts were hit hardest by disease and violence and decimated the most by European settlers. So you do have more indigenous people in the west sides of both countries in a very loose general way.
Thank you. If the attendee who sent it has a following up question, please feel free to send it. I will send you the second one, and I think last one. I want to be respectful with your time. Does the spatial arrangement of urban segregation in Brazilian cities characterized by the
Sorry, I lost you for a second. Can you start again with the question?
Of course, yes. Does the spatial arrangement of urban segregation in Brazilian cities characterized by the proximity of affluent neighborhoods to impoverished favelas affect the prevalence of full-time domestic workers? Specifically, does the geographical closeness of wealthy and poor neighborhoods in cities like Rio de Janeiro lead to a reduced demand for live-in domestic help?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I have to think about that. So it's very, Sao Paulo and Rio both have that phenomenon of extremely poor neighborhoods next to extremely wealthy neighborhoods. But amongst the domestic workers that I interviewed during my studies in Sao Paulo, I did all my interviews in Sao Paulo, almost all of the domestic workers who were not live-in but were full-time had very, very long commutes to get to their jobs. And so, and I would guess that hasn't changed very much right now. I think that even though there are these very, very disparate neighborhoods right next to each other in places like Sao Paulo, there probably aren't enough people that live really close to have a huge impact on that. But also, I showed you the picture of that, apartment in Sao Paulo that was being advertised in 2007, with 2 bedrooms for domestic workers. Um, I didn't mention there are even apartment buildings there was one that I saw in San Francisco that was built in the 1950s that had not in unit quarters for domestic workers, but actually had domestic workers quarters on a separate floor of an apartment building. And so I think we're seeing a significant decline right now in the number of live-in domestic workers in Brazil. It was hard for me to get strong data about live in, live out in Brazil, but everyone I spoke to said that live in is just becoming less and less common, and it's probably uneven across different cities. I think that the live in domestic workers more frequently, what I found are people who had recently migrated um, from other states, or from northeastern Brazil to southern Brazil. That was more common. And they're also, one of the reasons probably that data is hard to get on this. There are also hybrid relationships where you have live-in domestic workers who maybe sleep in the home 4 nights a week and then take a long commute it could be an hour, it could be a couple hours to go be with their family on a weekend. And yeah, so it's a great question. Worthy of study, something I don't have a firm and precise answer to.
Thank you. I don't know if you have time for one last question that we just received.
Yeah, is that the
Okay.
one that you sent me in the chat?
Yes, it's on the chat. I think you can see it there.
Okay. So do you want to read it while I think
Of
about it?
course.
Okay, thank you.
But traditional landholding elites in Brazil have had extended followers in the parentela system that bonded not just the men of a sharecropper family, but also children who could be brought forward for domestic service. Does this persist?
Yeah, this is a great question. Thank you. So I had a lot of long conversations with employers of domestic workers about uh, probing on this question of what exactly does it mean when you say she's part of the family, referring to the domestic worker. And often that meant that there was a relationship between the employer and the children of the domestic worker. Now, when I probed further on what that relationship is, um, this was touchy and difficult to do, and something I sometimes did only after developing a strong relationship with people that I spoke to. But I would ask questions like, so if the child of the domestic worker who you grew up with was part of your family, did you go to the same school as that child? And the answer was almost always no, because the children of employers um, would often go to private schools, and the children of the domestic worker would often go to public schools. And so that was a big point that highlighted the difference. And also when you ask about um, the domestic workers, um, that family relationship, another example that was frequently given I found was, oh, we give them all of our old furniture that we don't need, or we give them our clothes, they're like part of the family. um, and then I would ask sometimes, like, is there anyone that you're genetically related to that wanted that furniture or wanted those clothes? And usually the answer was no. And so the part of the family idea often breaks down when you probe on it in conversation. Now, this idea that the idea, however, that a child of a domestic worker in Brazil today, or in the last few decades, would then today become a domestic worker for the same family is very rare. And amongst, one of the questions in all of my interviews that I did with domestic workers and with employers was, what job would you like to have? Or what would be your first choice job? Or, what do you think your domestic workers' first choice job would be if they could have any other job? And so, the most common answers I got to questions like that were usually secretary or nurse. I don't know why exactly the, those two came up, but they're feminized or traditionally feminine um, positions, and they also are the nurse is a care job, and so that that fits with the stereotype. And so sometimes you'd have families that would pay for some kind of professional schooling for the domestic worker, and I think all of the domestic workers that I spoke to and families did they hoped for other jobs that were not domestic work for the children of the domestic workers. And I think that is also a big part of a traditional narrative around migration, since migration is so frequently part of the story of domestic workers or of their recent ancestors. So I think that idea of the children of the domestic workers going into domestic work is not something that people expect. And I think that social mobility in Brazil, although it is not great compared to other parts of the world, that it is a realistic opportunity to have an exit from domestic work for the child of a domestic worker in Brazil today. I don't think it's as nearly as common today, a multi-generational occupation as it would have been under slavery or in the decades or half century following the end of slavery in Brazil.
Thank you. Before ending the event, I want to thank you for taking the time to present and reflect on your latest work with us. I also want to thank our attendees for joining us, asking these great questions. We will post this event's recording in our upcoming newsletter, website, and social media platforms. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day. I don't know if you have any last words or comments that you would like to share with us.
No, I mean, this was really a pleasure to be here, and I think maybe just one last reflection I have is all of the times that I had American friends come visit me when I was living in Brazil, there was so much shock about the relationships between domestic workers and their employers on the part of Americans, and I want to make very, very clear that I'm not in any way saying that the economic relationships we have in the United States are in some way better. I think that our systems in the United States for contracting domestic workers are depersonalized and hidden. And we deliberately try to hide them. We try to escape them. We try not to be at home frequently. If we employ domestic workers, we hire companies to bring the domestic workers to us in the same way that we try not to think too much about what country our clothing was made in, where our cell phone came from, and where the products that we use every day come from. And so while there are very big differences in these relationships in the United States and Brazil, again, it's still not about better or worse, but it's about you know how we experience inequality. And I think there are really important things to be done to address the gross inequities that fall along these intersectional lines that we see in domestic work across these fissures of race and gender and class in both countries. And I think it's really important for us to become uncomfortable with domestic work and really look at it, face the historical context of it, and the relationships that are deeply embedded in it, and think about how we can create a more just society and just economy that gives people the opportunity gives everyone the opportunity to pursue the careers that they want and can be meaningful to them.
Thank you for those last words. Thank you,
Thanks
everyone.
so much.